Marriage equality in the United States might never have occurred had it not been for the efforts of Katherine Zappone and others leading the fight for marriage equality in Ireland. Born in Seattle in 1953, Katherine met her future wife, an Irish woman named Ann Louise, while the two were studying theology at Boston College in the 1980s. After being legally married in Canada in 2003, the couple then moved to Ireland, a deeply Catholic country where their marriage was not legally recognized. But then, as social activists, Katherine and Ann Louise began working to build support for same-sex marriage rights across the country. Their efforts led to the legalization of same-sex marriage in Ireland in 2015 by referendum, the first country ever to approve same-sex marriage by popular vote. Katherine's career as a social activist might have ended right there. But then, after stints in the Irish Houses of Parliament, she eventually became Ireland's Minister of Children and Youth Affairs, a post she held for 4 years. During her tenure in that position, Katherine dealt with one of that country's most notorious scandals, involving the discovery of a mass grave of children on the grounds of a mother and baby home run by the Catholic Church. In a remarkable moment, Katherine brought her concerns about this scandal directly to Pope Francis and helped to address a crisis that had roiled Ireland for decades. Recently, I sat down with Katherine to talk about her remarkable career as a social activist, as a same-sex marriage advocate, and as the first ever open married lesbian in Irish politics. She also talked with me about her new book, Love in a Time of Politics, a memoir of facing loss and finding hope. Part memoir and part love story, Love in a Time of Politics traces Katherine's meteoric rise in Irish political life, her efforts with her wife to secure marriage rights for same-sex couples, and the grief she had to navigate in public as a government official following Ann Louise's untimely death in 2017. Katherine Zappone, welcome to Profiles in LGBTQ Courage. It's wonderful to have you here today.
I'm so happy to be with you, Rick.
Katherine, you come with a great many distinctions. You were the first open married lesbian in Irish politics. You're also a former Irish senator and member of the Irish cabinet. But what you're best known for, I think, is your work with your late wife, Ann Louise Gilligan, in helping to spearhead the legalization of same-sex marriage in Ireland in 2015. And that's a big part of the reason that you're in the U.S. right now, beginning a book tour in connection with your new book, Love in a Time of Politics, a memoir of facing loss and finding hope. So let's begin there. Why did you write this book and why now?
I wrote it, I think, Rick, largely to pay tribute to the great Irish woman that Ann Louise was, and the ways in which she influenced and supported me to be a different kind of politician in Ireland. I'm originally American, as I say, and only became Irish by falling in love with this beautiful Irish woman when I met her in Boston College in the early 90s. And when we finished our study, a doctoral work, she invited me to go back to that land.
So I'm going to invite you because this memoir is both a political memoir, but it's also a love memoir.
Yes.
And would you share with us that quote on page 2 that I highlighted there for you about your time at Boston College?
I will do that. And this was a memory of Ann Louise that I had when I was, I suppose, really experience a deep moment of grieving her loss. I see Ann Louise running to class in high heels at Boston College, where we met in 1981. We were going to be late because our squash game had run over, she defeating me yet again as one of Ireland's champions in the sport. Her spirit held exuberance so naturally. Her beauty blew my mind. How magnetized was her power. My life would never be the same. we would begin a life journey together, looking for social change based on love.
So it sounds like it was love at first sight?
It was pretty much.
Or pretty soon thereafter.
Exactly. In early 80s, and let's, in Boston, in a Jesuit university, with a Catholic context where we were studying theology, and I know that's especially for some people maybe listening to before they were born, but it wasn't really like the time where you could be out and be cool in too many places, and certainly not in that kind of setting.
Yes.
So it was love at first sight, but we had to keep a lot of that to ourselves until we started sharing it with close friends.
So you had this courtship, and then you got married in Vancouver, right?
Yes.
In 2003.
Yes.
Talk a little bit about that.
Okay. Well, we as it went, fell in love, decided we wanted to live together for the rest of our lives, had it for our first ceremony, which we called a life partnership ceremony in Boston in the early 80s. And then I go to Ireland, time passes, and we ultimately decide that, we would really like our life partnership recognized in law. And things were starting to change in Europe. And also in Boston, as the great, LGBTQ organizations were advocating and leading towards that wonderful judgment in the mid-2000s in terms of allowing marriage equality in the state. And so we said, we really want to have our own partnership recognized in law, look for different ways to do it. And eventually, as we were doing that, found that the great province of British Columbia in Canada opened its doors to anyone to marry, whoever they were, and they didn't have to be a citizen or a resident. Mm-hmm. So we, kind of really within 3 months, we were over there, we got married, we came back to Ireland, and we simply then looked for a change, effectively, of both marital status and tax status in the country of Ireland. Say, well, we got married outside the country. We want to just say we're now married and treat us as married a couple in terms of our tax returns.
So
they said no, by the way.
They said no, but
exactly.
But you persisted, right?
And then we took the big case against the Irish state.
Yes.
And that effectively, Rick, I think it was recognized as the catalyst for the marriage equality movement in the country.
So what length of time are we talking about here from the time your case was initially rejected to when momentum began to build?
Well, we started preparing for the case in 2000. The momentum began to build really, especially when we lost at the high court level. We established with others, we established an advocacy organization called Marriage Equality, and that's what then started to build the momentum for effectively what became a road towards the people making the choice to allow same-sex marriage.
And the duration of time, this did not happen overnight. This was a number of years.
It was about 15 years since we started.
And did it ever get ugly when you were campaigning and going door to door?
Absolutely. And Rick, especially with the young people and especially young men, and Ann Louise and I would be out on the doorstep with some of them, and they would start chatting to say, would you consider voting yes? And there were times people would spit at them or say terrible things, and often, they would come away from the door so disheartened, and Ann Louise would just place her arms around them and just say, you are a beautiful young man, and we are moving forward, and believe in that.
And then May 22nd, 2015, the famous landmark referendum, which legalized same-sex marriage, and Ireland was the first country to acclaim this or legitimate this by popular vote, right?
By the vote of the people. The people decided to vote for us.
Talk about that day.
Look, it was for all of us who had worked so hard, and as I said, our allies as well as ourselves, and had an incredibly strategic campaign had been conducted, going to the doors of everyone throughout the country at least a couple of times. But I think and us hoping, even honestly, Rick, the night before the vote, we weren't sure. We weren't sure, even though the polls were demonstrating that it looked like it might be in our favor. I mean, as you said at the beginning, this was a Catholic country. And were they going to vote for us? And by the time we woke up the next morning, we were hearing on the radio that a couple of the leaders of the opposition were conceding. And so, I said, come on, Ann Louise, let's get dressed and run to the count centers, which we did. And the numbers just kept rolling in. And once the other thing that was extraordinary, and again, these iconic images that came from Dublin Castle, the minister in charge of the use of Dublin Castle could see in the morning that it was going to be a win. So he allowed a crowd to gather in the midst of the Dublin Castle. And by the time we were all there and the last count had been heard in terms of the county's count coming in, it was just extraordinary to feel that acceptance as people who had been excluded for so long. And, the reality is that there actually was a couple of rainbows, real rainbows going across the castle at that moment. And little did we know, but of course that was the beginning of Ireland becoming a beacon of hope to the rest of the world in relation to particularly that issue.
So with that in mind, I'd like to ask you to read this passage on page 109 about that day, beginning with that paragraph, and so.
And so when we enter the castle courtyard on the 23rd of May, 2015, it is a moment of pure jubilation. 2,000 people have gathered to witness one of Ireland's most historic moments. Equal signs everywhere. Rainbow flags are flying. The final county result is called "We Have Won." Some 62% of the Irish population have voted "Tá," which is Irish for yes. And 71.3% of Dublin Southwest, where I was a representative of that geographic region, have also voted yes. This is the first time that a country or state has legalized marriage equality by popular vote. Being in the courtyard and being able to go onto the stage with Ann Louise, to lift up our arms together, to look at the crowd, we are euphoric. I bring her down to the crowds and move close to the stage. Miriam O'Callaghan, one of our primary broadcasters of RTE, wants to interview us. And it is then I turn to Ann Louise and say, "Ann Louise, will you marry me?" She says yes. We kiss on television, and that kiss goes around the world to 12.5 million viewers online. Pure joy again.
I'm really curious how you were able to accomplish this in the epitome of a Catholic country.
Indeed, exactly. Well, to be fair, the Catholic Church in Ireland had started to lose some of its moral authority because of the discoveries of effectively abuse of women and children happen in institutional settings. And as that became known more and more, people started to question the moral authority. And it was in that context that we brought forward this desire of same-sex marriage.
Well, I know that you served as Minister of Children and Youth Affairs for Ireland for 4 years, and I think you're speaking of the Tuam Mother and Baby Home episode.
Yes.
For those in this country who are not familiar with this, it's a pretty notorious example of child abuse at the hands of the Catholic Church. Can you give us a little bit of the context and the background of the story?
Exactly, and it is. There were a number of what we called mother and baby homes that were established throughout the country, usually run by religious orders, but also sometimes, by the state, the local authority. And effectively, if a woman became pregnant and wasn't married, often she found herself being brought to these homes to have her child, and then they experienced different types of abuse. Really, not necessarily physical, but they were put to doing slave labor, etc. Had their child in that context. In Tuam, in County Galway, there was one mother and baby institution. A local historian had found lots of evidence. She felt that there were at least 650 children who were buried on the grounds of that institution without anyone knowing it and with no proper burial or even who they were. And so the government decided to set up an investigation to see were that the case. I was the Minister for Children at the time that the commission that was investigating actually discovered some juvenile remains at Tuam. And, this discovery and it seemed as if they were tossed in a sewage system outside of the home, really it was just devastating. I was brought into a room, and the people who are doing the work told me and showed me some of the slides of the remains, and just was, just as I said, just devastated, trying to figure out how should the state respond to this horrific thing that had happened to our children in the relatively recent past.
This place only closed in 1961.
Correct.
Right? Yeah.
That's right. And so it was my job ultimately to find a way to get my government colleagues, other cabinet ministers, to agree that no matter what, we needed to try to find, if we could find the remains, to see if we could identify them, because many people felt that they were related to the children who had been buried in the dark of night, and that there were survivors, meaning people who had actually lived in those homes and had been there at the same time. So it was, how would the government appropriately respond to that? And I got a government decision to say whatever it takes and whatever money it takes, and it's now only now that they are beginning the exhumation of any remains.
You actually spoke to the Pope about this.
I did.
Tell me about that exchange and what happened as a result of you sharing with him your concerns about this.
Well, actually, Pope Francis was coming to Ireland as a lesbian married woman. I had decided that, but as a cabinet minister too, I would go and hear his speeches along with my colleagues, but I really didn't want to have much other engagement with him. One afternoon, the secretary of the department of our prime minister said, Minister Zappone, will you actually greet the Pope when he arrives in the country? And I said, Martin, I don't know if I can do that, because he and his organization doesn't have a place for people like me. And he said, well, actually, Minister, we think it would be very powerful to show the world a lesbian minister shaking hands with the Pope as he is greeted. So I thought, okay, I'll come. And, I thought, can I have a word with him? And he said, you've got about 30 seconds. You're just going to shake his hand. I thought that was enough time to give him a message. And so we spent with my advisors the next couple of weeks identifying what did I want to say to the Pope, and said it must be about the children who were, thrown into the ground at the dead of night, who had died, and we don't know how they died, to let him know that this had happened and that the church needs to take responsibility for it. So that's what we did. I put together a message that lasted 30 seconds. We translated it into Italian. I had tried to learn the language a little bit the summer before, not very successfully. So I spent a lot of time memorizing those lines. And I then had the opportunity to meet him and started shaking his hand. He's such a tall man. I'm not that tall myself. And he's looking down at me, and I give him, Benvenuta Papa Francesca, and give my few lines. Terrified, Rick, that he's going to ask me a question in Italian. I'm going to have to respond back. And he says instead, thank you for saying that to me in English. So he really heard, the plea, and especially my request that the Catholic Church take responsibility for this. And, it could have ended at that, but it didn't. We all went off to the big Dublin castle where he was giving his speech, and he had his script, and all of a sudden he looked up and he said, and the words of the Minister for Children are still echoing in my heart. He references the tomb issue. And I had given him a longer memo to say, this is what happened, and we want reparation from the church or from the religious orders. And he said he would study it on the way back on the plane. Anyhow, eventually, the sisters who were responsible for that particular mother and baby institution agreed to give a certain sum of money to help us in the process of trying to find the remains.
So what did that experience of interacting with him, what did you learn about politics, about leadership, about courage in that moment?
Well, courage, I was terrified to do it, frankly, even though, I can be pretty strong at times, but I just felt I had this opportunity. And, the best things are done. biggest things are done, I think, in the world is if, everybody experiences fear. If you accept the fear and decide to move through it. Secondly, what I learned is that profound change comes through a personal connection. And I had a personal connection with Francis. He heard me, Rick. I could see that he did. And then I heard him say, I will consider this and I will try to. I have no idea what really he did in the background after that.
But did he clearly do something?
Well, he said that he was going to pray for us. So I wondered, what did that mean? And it could have been other things, and whether it's connecting with the sisters or not. But it was a really big symbol of, I am on your side. I think we do need to take responsibility. But it was that personal connection and the willingness, to kind of move beyond the fear.
I don't think you sought out to become a politician,
No,
right?
I didn't.
I mean, you were studying theology at Boston College.
Well, first of all, I was invited into politics. I was appointed by the prime minister of the day to our upper house, or it's called the Seanad. In our constitution, there can be 11 people appointed to a 60-member Senate. And I was asked to join the Seanad at the time when Ann Louise and I were taking a case against the Irish state. So already that indicated to me there was an openness by the political leaders, but they were the political leaders of a very socially conservative political party. So they were willing to listen. And I just took them at their word. And I found opportunities then I loved talking. I believe in the power of language and in the Seanad raising the different issues as a woman, as a lesbian, and as somebody who was, from a minority community. And I think I gained respect for that. But also they were willing to establish relationships of respect for me. I tell the story in the book about how the prime minister who appointed me, invited me to his very big office one day, not long after he had appointed me. And I had sent him a copy. Ann Louise and I wrote a memoir of the case, taking of this case. I sent him that before I went to see him. And I got to his office and we sat down in these big plush chairs in front of a big fireplace. And he opened the meeting with quoting to me 2 paragraphs by memory of our book. And he was a man who was against marriage equality at that point. Mm. And so it indicated to me that I was, as we say in Ireland, gobsmacked. But I thought, wow, I can feel his heart and mind is opening. And eventually he chose to campaign on behalf of it.
I think for American listeners, people would be interested to hear, is everyone in Ireland appointed to the Senate or?
Yes.
Okay.
No, the other 40 whatever spots are elected. They are elected. Exactly.
Okay.
But what happened, once I finished the 5 years, I decided, okay, I like politics, but there's a lot more power in the Dáil, or what's comparable to the House of Representatives here. So I actually ran for office, or for a seat, as we say, and I won. Barely, it has to be said. And then and I ran as an independent, as a progressive. And the political party that had the most seats didn't have enough seats to form a government. This is a different system than what happens in the United States, but people are probably familiar. Lots of European countries go this way. You need so many seats, so certain number to actually form a government. So they invited in independents to say, will you join us? Will you give us your vote? And I said, maybe, but as long as you respect some of these red line issues that I identified to them. And once they agreed, I said, okay, I will join your government.
So you and Ann Louise were so active in campaigning on behalf of same-sex marriage. She was your wife. She was your soulmate. And then she died in 2017. So can you share a little bit about that moment?
I can.
And what happened?
Yes, I can. Ann Louise was very ill. Really, within the first number of months of my ministry, she had experienced a second brain hemorrhage. We thought the first one, she was recovering from that relatively well, but then she was struck again in March of 2017. And I had only been minister for a few months then. She went into hospital, and for 87 days, effectively, she worked really hard to heal herself, but ultimately it was not meant to be. I had a number of family and friends that accompanied me during that time to try to cope with, I suppose, the days where I was coming to terms with that I would lose the most important person in my life, the love of my life, but also my counselor, my political advisor. She was the one who told me, what to wear when I would go in to do my special moments, or what. She just everything about our relationship. She helped me to be the independent, progressive, married lesbian in government. So as she started to slip away, it was a real learning, and I felt really accompanied by everyone else, and she really worked hard not to slip away. She just when the team of her doctors told me that actually she had this really terrible disease and actually she wasn't going to make it, that effectively her brain was bleeding. I said, well, when should we tell Ann Louise? They said, why not now? We went into her room after that. They told her. She sat up in her wheelchair because she was paralyzed on the left-hand side. And she said, okay, now, gentlemen, I'm tired now. I'd like to go back to my bed. She goes back to bed, and I sit over next to her, and she says, Katherine, did Joe, which was her primary consultant, did Joe just tell me that I am dying? And I said, yes, Ann Louise, he did. And then I asked her the question, Ann Louise, are you afraid of dying? And immediately she said, nope. I wasn't afraid coming into the world, and I'm not going to be afraid going out. It was that kind of extraordinary courage. And at this stage, she had lost some of her cognitive capacity because her brain was bleeding, but that was her response. So, it was just an incredible, I was loss and devastation, and I had a very big job to continue to do.
And I think you shared with me that she basically wanted you to go on.
She
right?
wanted me to go on. Well, she had been listening to a program on the radio, again in hospital, about the loss of this great Northerner during the Troubles, a man named Seamus Mallon, and it was his funeral. And she said, Katherine, you have to decide: are you going to continue to work for change on the streets protesting, or are you going to go inside to do the work? And I said, well, I feel I'm making a difference inside, meaning inside the power, the political power that you have to exercise. And she said, well, I want you to continue to do that.
And so you did go on. And in addition to being, you and Ann Louise, the tip of the spear around same-sex marriage, you also became involved and helped to overturn Ireland's laws regarding abortion. So talk about that.
I did. I had been, and Ann Louise too, we'd worked somewhat on the campaign to what we called repeal the ban. There was a ban on abortion services placed into our Constitution in the early 80s. So we had worked to try to take that out for years, again, a Catholic country. But it also was an issue more than same-sex marriage, that people, within the same families couldn't talk to one another if they disagreed. It just was one of our first real polarized issues. And, being in my negotiations to whether I would or wouldn't join government, and they wanted me to join, I said, well, I will only join if you agree to have what we called a citizens' assembly, which is a way of practicing democracy, where 100 citizens gather, who are anonymously chosen to look at a particular issue, to hear evidence on both sides, yes or no, to just debate with each other and make recommendations to government what they wanted to do about that. And, the party I was negotiating with kind of dragged its feet. Well, yes, maybe, they said. And I said, no, you have to write it in the program for government that we're going to do that, because I believed it worked. We did that with marriage equality. And that's what then started to help change people's hearts and minds when a citizens' assembly debated it. And women from all over the country fed in their stories of what it was like to not be able to make a choice in relation to their own reproductive freedom. So anyhow, fast forward, we had that. It recommended to government. And then what I decided to do, Rick, was to adopt. My position was a member of cabinet. I was no longer an outsider activist. And so I decided my role was to try to offer arguments to my cabinet colleagues as to why they should support a referendum to say yes to women's reproductive freedom. And that's what I did at the cabinet table a number of times. Most of these men, and there were a couple of other women, had been raised Catholic and had, I suppose really had thought about it up to a point, but not really as deeply as they could have. And so anyhow, that's the role I took, and I think it contributed to the work of all the women and men working on the outside to move towards that day.
And so the law was overturned in
it was 3 years later, 2018.
2018.
Yeah,
and,
exactly.
A lot of people, Katherine, in this country now are saying that our politics are broken. And I want to ask you about that. But first, I want to ask you, based on your experience as an American who became Irish, what can our country learn from Ireland about democracy?
Excellent question. I think the first thing I'd say is that there are a number of ways to practice democracy. And this vehicle that I've been describing as Citizens Assembly was a prime example of, it's not a prime example of a different way of doing democracy. So, it is not enough to simply vote for your public representative. We must all, first of all, believe that we can make a difference, and that the question for us really, and again, as the great Jane Goodall said recently in her famous last words, that to believe that we can make a difference, and it's really simply up to us to decide what difference do we want to make. And so to believe in that, to take some responsibility, to bring people together around you and to talk and to listen. This is one of the difficulties in the country right now here, as it was in Ireland. You couldn't, if you knew people were against you, you couldn't even talk to them. We need to find ways to talk to each other again and ways of listening. And then ultimately on the basis of that, make decisions, act, and move forward together. Above all, though, I guess I would say, is that what I learned in both the major change of marriage equality and repealing of the ban against women's reproductive freedom was that we have, hope is an essential ingredient, and it is in the doing of looking for the change that hope comes, and really comes fiercely to help us keep going. It is in the doing that it is there, not in the sitting on the sidelines.
So as a woman, I'm curious, what's your advice to women leaders, be they in politics or business or the arts? What's your advice as to how to persevere when at times it's tough?
First of all, we have to just continue to find ways to believe in ourselves. Secondly, we need to come together as women and to support each other and to talk about what are the difficulties and the challenges. And then thirdly, to actually change some of the systems of politics and governance that block us from our full participation. Something as simple as, early childhood care and education centers on the grounds of the Houses of Parliament. As well as in Ireland, when I was governing, one of the things that we did was change the hours of voting. Most of the voting happened into the wee hours of the evening, and so you couldn't go home to whatever, be with your family.
As we have this interview, I found the figure that said to date some 6,000 same-sex marriages have been celebrated in Ireland since the amendment. When you hear that figure, how does it make you feel?
I'm thrilled. But it makes me feel, or it leads me to think about the young people, the young LGBTQ, especially, a lot of them identify as queer now, meaning like I want to find out who I am, but I know that I am different, and that they are freer to take that journey. And that's something that Ann Louise and I always wanted from the moment we were doing it for ourselves, but we always wanted to do it for the young people. That's what it I think about them.
And we're living again in these really fraught times right now. What is your advice to your fellow Americans to combat the toxic partisanship?
Never, never, never give up. As I said, especially once you realize you can make a difference, that you just need to decide what it is that you want to do, bring people together.
Well, is there anything, Katherine, I have not asked you about, but that has percolated up that you'd like to share as we begin to wrap up here?
Yeah, I think you've covered most things, but I want maybe to just end with I'm reminded of a few words by one of our great poets, and he was awarded Nobel laureate. He's Seamus Heaney. He was from the North, lived through our conflicts of the Northern Troubles, as we called them, and he talked a lot in his poetry about staying the course, stepping up, and all of the ways that he did that. But he said, at some stage, that the tidal wave of justice will rise, and hope and history will rhyme.
Well, because your book is a love memoir, I want to close and have you read one more passage. It's on page 211. And if you could give us just a little bit of a context for these remarks.
These were part of what I spoke at Ann Louise's funeral. It was an extraordinary event, and I had just been appointed Minister for Children for the second time because we had a new prime minister, and all of my cabinet colleagues arrived to the big event. I felt like the whole country was there. Anyhow, this is some of the words I said to recognize her beauty and her just extraordinary power as a human being. How do I love thee, Ann Louise? Let me count the ways. I love your fearlessness, especially when it was mixed with your great sense of fun. Ann Louise drove a bright red BMW motor scooter for years and stopped only because of blindness after her first hemorrhage. It was one of the hardest letting goes for her. Prior to that, however, several times a week, she would gear up, put on the big helmet, and drive the bike out our gate. I would often watch as she left, bless myself, and try to celebrate the freedom she felt on that bike. How do I love thee, Ann Louise? I love your extraordinary sense of hope that fuels your positive approach to all things in life, especially its greatest challenges. And after her last visit to the eye specialist in Beaumont Hospital a number of months ago now, Ann Louise wrote in her journal, "My sight has not improved, but my capacity to use what I have left has improved. I love your wisdom and depth of acceptance of what is given. I love your beautiful mind, your brilliance, creativity, and the ways you thought deeply about everything. I love how you loved me. Ann Louise was so proud of my appointment as an Irish cabinet minister, she waited for my reappointment and passed away quietly and peacefully only hours after it happened. And now, in the presence of all gathered, I have to let you go, beloved."
Katherine Zappone, thank you for being my guest today on Profiles in LGBTQ Courage. Thank you for listening to today's interview. Founded in 1973, PFLAG is the first and largest organization for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer people and their parents, families, friends, and allies. We have over 400 chapters and more than 200,000 members and supporters nationwide. Our members come from every generation and live in cities, small towns, and rural areas across the United States. PFLAG is committed to creating a world where diversity is celebrated and all people are respected, valued, and affirmed. For more information about PFLAG, explore the rest of this website or visit PFLAG National at pflag.org.